Good afternoon, folks. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Stakeholder Web Conference that the ISO is hosting to discuss the latest updated effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, study results for demand response, or DR resources. And we thank you, E3, who worked on these and who is here today to present them. So thanks very much for joining us today. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and let my colleagues here introduce themselves. As mentioned, we're also thankful to have E3 here, who did amazing work on the study results, and who will be presenting them after the ISO discusses some background. So from the ISO, we have Delphine.
Hi, this is Delphine, Director of California Regulatory Affairs. Thank you.
Thanks, Delphine. John.
John Gooden, Senior Manager, Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy.
Thanks, John. And Eric?
Hi, all. This is Eric, California Regulatory Affairs Associate.
Thanks much, Eric. And from E3, we have Zach.
Hi, this is Zach Ming, a Director with E3 in our Resource Planning Group. I'll be doing the bulk of the presenting today from E3's side.
Thanks, Zach. And Vignesh?
Hi, everyone. I'm Vignesh Venugopal, a consultant at E3.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Our agenda for today, as you can see, is to first discuss some background, as mentioned, in order to provide some context for this update. And for those who may not be familiar with this effort, followed by, as mentioned, our main presentation, in which E3 will discuss the latest DR study results. We are asking for questions, substantive questions at least, to be addressed following the discussion, but we are happy to field any clarifying questions throughout the discussion. So if we see any hands raised, which you can do by pressing #2 on your phone or through the icon on your by your name on the screen, we'll be sure to monitor for any clarifying questions throughout the discussion so that we can pause accordingly. But we do appreciate it if we can save the actual substantive questions for the end, which we've devoted some Q&A to, as you can see right there. And then after Q&A, we'll discuss next steps and how to submit comments. So in addition, the call today is recorded for convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to recordings after the meeting. The recording will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meeting. And of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions we ask should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. The recording will be available along with the other meeting material on the website. And with that, I will hand it over to John to discuss some background.
Thank you, Jimmy, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. Why don't we turn to the next slide? Thanks. I just want to take a couple of minutes to give a quick overview of the evolution of this particular issue. I know many of you are familiar with it, but just for those that aren't, we'll just do a quick, again, intro on the background. So 2-3 years ago, we had the supply side working group held through the PUC and PUC interested parties. And they were seeking modifications to the treatment of demand response resources as variable resources. So the background is that the current qualifying capacity counting methodology really treats DR as a fixed capacity resource, as if it can deliver the same megawatt quantity any hour it's called on any day. And I think we've all realized that, in fact, most of load curtailment, traditional demand response, has a variable nature that's really dependent on temperature, weather, occupancy, production, day a week, hour a day, many variables that can cause DR output to vary. So we began a discussion about how that might factor in that variability into its qualifying capacity value. There were some presentations about the ELCC methodology used for wind and solar, which are variable resources, to try to tee up some discussion about how that approach works. And the ISO specifically proposed applying an ELCC approach to DR. On the ISO side, we took up our ESDR 4, fourth phase of our Energy Storage and Distributed Energy Resources Initiative, 2019 to 2020. That explored many topics, but one of them was how ELCC could be applied and inform a qualifying capacity value for demand response that has a variable output. The ISO hired E3 to perform this study on existing IOU demand response programs, and specifically SCE and PG&E. And those results were discussed and vetted as part of the ESDR 4. Next slide, Jimmy. Thank you. These discussions made their way more formally into PUC proceedings. Specifically, in 2020, the CPUC's RA proceeding, ISO proposed and Track 2 and adoption of the ELCC by the end of the Track 4. And then in the CPUC RA proceeding in 2021, the ISO entered the E3 study results in the Track 3B1 proceeding. And the ISO here is submitting, or will be submitting, updated ELCC results applicable to the 2022 RA year, while a more durable, longer-term solution to this issue is addressed through a CEC process as decided by the PUC. Next slide, please. Okay, I won't walk through each of these, but let's start with today. There's been quite a bit of background on this particular process with Commissioner Batcher ruling on the RA proceeding, setting a July 1 deadline for an updated report that will consider QC adjustments based on ELCC study results for the 2022 RA compliance year. ISO reinitiated its contract with E3 to perform the updated study. This updated study includes both SCE and PG&E as before, but also SDG&E as well. And that's what E3 will talk about, is these updated results. So the process going forward is we'll have a stakeholder review, obviously, of this today. Stakeholder comments are due on the 28th, and then the ELCC report is due to the Commission on July 1, as per Commissioner Batcher. Next step, or next slide, please. So on July 1, the ruling requested that the refresh study results be based upon 2020 bid data from the 3 IOUs, that we document the study results and assumptions and do some comparison to the load impact protocols. In the update, a summary of the key differences between the load impact inputs and the calculations proposed under the ELCC methodology. And then finally, a workshop report summarizing party comments on the study methodology and results, and attached parties' comments. So these 4 things are really deliverable that President Batcher outlined, and that's what we intend to deliver. Again, it's been a very, very compressed time frame. I want to thank E3 for stepping up and being able to do this in very short order, as well as the utilities pulling their data together very quickly. I know it's been a lot of work, and we've had a lot of conversations, but today is really the culmination of that work and the first public vetting of this. So with that, Jimmy, next slide. I will turn it over to E3, Zach and Vignesh to take it from here and give us the updated results. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, John. Operator, if you could please fling the presenting rights over to Zach. Appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you, John, Jimmy, and everyone, and good to be with everyone. This is Zach Ming from E3. I will be doing the bulk of the presenting today, but Vignesh is also on the line from E3 and definitely available to answer any questions as they come up, as well as chime in if I miss anything or say anything incorrectly. We're going to try to get through the presentation with just clarifying questions. So if there are clarifying questions, please send those in. And then, like John said, we save towards the end of the presentation some time for discussion and broader, more general questions. So we'll definitely try to save some time for that. So if we just jump straight into the presentation, and John just gave a really nice overview and background, so we have some of the same information. I'll try to gloss over it a little bit more quickly since we've already covered it, but just to refresh everyone, we originally released a study last May that had this data. The study we released last May, in May of 2020, obviously 2020 wasn't done yet, so we didn't have 2020 bid data. But we released a study on the ELCC of demand response based on 2019 data. Then towards the end of last year, in December 2020, we released an update that was still using 2019 data, but it had some modifications to the way that some modifications to the bids based on a new updated bidding strategy from SCE. So we refreshed the results, and then today, June 2021, we're releasing yet another update of the study. This actually is based on 2020 data. So in 2021, obviously we have all of 2020 data. So this is based on 2020 data. So this is an update, a refresh using the latest data with all of the utilities included. So previously we were just looking at PG&E and FCE. Now we're also including SDG&E. So that's really what today is. We are going to, before we get into the results, I know that's what everyone's anxious to see, we are going to do a brief background on ELCC and the recap model, which is the model we use to calculate ELCC. And we've gone over this before. I know some folks are familiar with this, but this does seem to be a recurring theme of questions about these topics and exactly what ELCC is and how it works. So we do have a couple slides on that. So John covered this. I'll briefly talk about this. But again, really the genesis of this project is based in the idea that the CPUC, California Public Utilities Commission, is in charge of accrediting the capacity value of every resource in the California system, the CAISO system. And there are values that they use for wind and solar and demand response as well. A couple years ago, it became pretty obvious looking at the data that the value that demand response was bidding into the market in aggregate was less than the amount that those resources were being counted for in the resource adequacy program, the RA program that's administered by the CPUC. So this entire process, this entire study is really trying to get a better data and more analysis into the actual value of demand response resources in the way that they bid into and show up in the CAISO market. Brief disclaimer, this study has been prepared by E3 for the CAISO, and this is separate from and unrelated to any work that E3 is also doing for the CPUC. So this is technical analysis that's being used to provide information to the CAISO and other parties, and this presentation is not endorsing any specific policy or regulatory recommendation. Okay, so let's jump straight in. And I think as far as clarifying questions, I'm personally not seeing those pop up as I'm talking, but anyone from CAISO, if there's just feel free to interject audibly if there's a question that we can clarify. All right, so effective load carrying capability, or ELCC. ELCC is really a measure of the equivalent perfect capacity that any imperfect resource can provide. So imperfect resources would be namely resources like wind and solar, those are intermittent resources, or energy limited resources like storage and demand response. And so it's just taking the capacity value of those resources and putting it on an apples-to-apples basis with other perfect or dispatchable resources so that you can count those resources towards the total capacity requirements of the system. And what we've seen across North America over the past, few years, even up to 10 years, is that the industry has been shifting towards ELCC as a best practice for crediting the capacity of these imperfect resources. The CPUC has been on the leading edge of this trend. 5 years ago, plus or minus, the CPUC began to use ELCC as the method for crediting wind and solar. And MISO quickly followed. That's the Midwest Independent System Operator. And now we've even seen PJM and SPP, two large deregulated markets in the U.S., also announce that they're planning to move towards ELCC as the method for valuing these resources in the next couple of years. And, you even have other markets that are beginning to publicly explore. So really, in E3's view, it's only a matter of time before this is, the ubiquitous method that's used to value these resources. The calculation steps for determining ELCC are listed below. And all of calculating ELCC relies on a loss of load probability model, or an LOLP model. The primary steps for determining the ELCC of any resource, this is true for demand response or wind or solar or anything, is you start with a system that doesn't have the resource you're trying to measure. And you calibrate it so that it meets the target reliability standard for whatever jurisdiction you're looking at. So we use the 1 day and 10-year standard, which is the 1 day, 1 day and 10-year loss of load expectation, or LOLE standard. So you start with the system, you run a big simulation, ensure that it's meeting the standard. You add the resource that you're trying to measure the ELCC of. Anytime you add a resource to the system, you're adding capability that improves the reliability of the system, and that makes it more reliable than the target. So, less fewer than 1 day per year, or 1 day per 10 years of lost load. And when the system is more reliable than the target, that allows you to remove perfect capacity from the system to get back to the original level of target reliability. And that amount of perfect capacity that can be removed from the system is the ELCC of whatever resource you're measuring. So that's a brief overview of ELCC, what it is, but ultimately it's grounded in the principles of loss of load probability modeling. One of the complexities of ELCC, which really is a feature, but it's a complexity nonetheless, is that the order in which you measure the ELCC of different resources matters. So from a big picture perspective, you can always measure the portfolio of all imperfect resources on the system. So the combined capability of wind and solar, demand response, of storage, of any resource that you want to lump into the quote-unquote portfolio. And you will always get the same value for the portfolio value. But if you want to attribute that portfolio value to individual resources or individual classes of resources, that's where it gets tricky. You can either determine an order to the resources. So you could say, I'm going to measure demand response first, and then layer solar into a system that already has demand response. Or you can say, I'm going to measure solar first, and then layer demand response into a system that already has solar. Depending on the order, you're going to get different values for demand response or for solar. And so, this introduces a complexity in terms of, is demand response, should it be valued at its first in value or its last in value? If you just count both resources at their first in value, you might run into a situation where solar plus demand response does not equal their combined capability, because you're missing interactive effects between those two resources, and that's illustrated in this third bucket right here. Or if you measure both resources on a last-in basis, that also might not equal the portfolio because you'd be double counting their interactive effects. So the point here really is that there are multiple ways to measure the ELCC of an individual resource, and so we're going to be showing demand response ELCC today from both a first-in and a last-in perspective. And I think I'm getting a very slight amount of background noise. I'm not sure if everyone on the panelist crew is muted, but if you're not, I might go ahead and mute. So what is first-in ELCC? First-in ELCC really is the ability of any resource to provide capacity absent interactions with any other resources on the system. So from a demand response perspective, this is really the ability of demand response to clip the peak, which is historically how demand response has been used, because there really weren't that many other imperfect resources on the system. Mostly the other resources on the system were dispatchable resources like natural gas, hydro, nuclear, etc. Resources that could generate for very long periods of time. So this is historically really how demand response has been used. If we look at a last-in basis, last-in means how is demand response used when all the other resources are on the system. And so because we have a lot of solar in the middle of the day, we definitely don't need to use any demand response in the middle of the day, even if loads are very high. And because we have a lot of storage, it might make sense to dispatch storage before we dispatch demand response. And so demand response does provide value, but the question is really, how does it provide value optimally through interactions with other resources on the system? So that's really the two different perspectives, the first-in and the last-in perspective. A brief overview of RECAP. RECAP is the loss of load probability model that we use to run all the calculations in this study. Again, loss of load probability modeling is foundational to ELCC calculations because you have to calculate what is the reliability of the system. You have to calibrate it first, then you add the resource, and then you remove perfect capacity until you get back to that original level of reliability. And so to calculate the reliability of the system, you need a loss of load probability model. And a loss of load probability model is really just a model that takes an electricity system that has a set of hourly loads that represent loads over many different weather conditions, many different weather years, and combines those potential load requirements with a electricity portfolio comprised of dispatchable generation, renewable generation, hydro storage, and demand response. And by simulating the system many times, potentially 1,000 years, which is really just 1,000 years of different load conditions, renewable conditions, generator forced outage rate conditions, by simulating the system under lots of different conditions, you can get a very robust estimate of the reliability of the system. And as we said, one of the outputs that falls out of this type of modeling not only is the loss of load expectation, which measures the reliability of the system, but you can use this to measure the ELCC of any specific resource or the portfolio of resources. So this is just a brief overview of some of the inputs and the outputs of the E3 RECAP model. And again, there are lots of different loss of load probability models that exist in the electricity sector. RECAP is just one of those models, but we found that generally these models do produce relatively similar results. And so we think all of the results that you see today that were calculated using the RECAP model are in line with other loss of load probability models. For example, the SERVM model from Astrape Consulting, which is the loss of load probability model that's used in the CPC resource adequacy process. We've done benchmarking in various projects for that model and found that they produce very similar results. And I will skip over this slide right here, but this is just sort of a step-by-step of exactly how the recap model determines reliability of the system by first calculating hourly loads and then one by one layering on the different resources, particularly for storage and demand response and hydro, actually. Those resources do have to be dispatched, so the model determines the optimal way from a reliability perspective to utilize those resources. For other resources like renewables and traditional dispatchable generation like natural gas or nuclear, the model isn't dispatching those resources, just looking at the availability of those resources. So what is the production profiles of those resources, or what are the random availability or forced outages of those resources? Okay, so that is a high-level overview of the background as well as the modeling methodology that we use. So with that, we will jump straight into the results. And just want to make sure here, I'm seeing a number of questions that have been posted into the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I have been receiving some questions. I just want to make sure.
Okay.
Some of them are substantive, which we can save, and I appreciate folks waiting on those. So we do have another clarifying question that just came in, actually, from Luke Tugas from CEDMC, asking regarding the statement by E3 that ELCC is becoming an industry standard practice, PJM, MISO, et cetera. Does this apply to intermittent resources only or DR as well?
So, yeah, generally the need to transition towards more sophisticated, robust metrics like ELCC is to a large extent driven by the increasing penetrations of these resources. When you have a small quantity of a resource on the system, you can get away with some looser, more simple metrics. And so then that's historically what all of the different system operators have done. Wind and solar penetrations have recently gotten so large in many markets that ELCC is a necessity. Demand response is a historical resource that existed, but it hasn't, it's not necessarily grown to the same level. So some of the markets haven't yet used ELCC for demand response, but I think that is something that they're all looking at. I know PJM is looking at that. So, CAISO uses ELCC for wind and solar. CPUC uses ELCC for wind and solar, is investigating that metric for storage and demand response. So I think it's really something that every market's looking at, and sort of the transition is underway, and there's a lot of factors that influence that transition.
Great, thanks, Zach. And I just want to check with Ethan, do we still have a hand raised? I'm not sure if Paul Nelson's still in the queue. I believe I should have addressed all of your clarifying questions, Paul, but please, I don't want to mute you for trying to get your hand out. So I just want to confirm that you're okay with that and could save the, you got a question over capacity for the end that we can save.
We do have a hand raised in the queue at this time. I believe it still may be the same caller.
Okay. Do we want to take that clarifying question now, or save that till the end?
Operator, did you unmute the line? I don't know if the caller is still there. Sounds like there's no more questions.
Apologies. The caller's still here. I have not unmuted the line. Would you like me to unmute now?
Yes, please.
Caller, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with CLECA. The question I have is back on sort of the introduction that John Gooden had, I think back on slide 7. It sort of listed some of the items that were going to be in the commission report. And so the question I have is this presentation, is this considered the documentation to study methodology and assumptions that will be included in the commission report? Is that what this presentation is considered in compliance with item 2 on that?
From E3, yes. I think the answer to the question is yes.
And from the CAISO?
Yes, Paul, it's correct. I confirm that this would be the results that were finalized as posted, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. You can go ahead. I think we have no more questions.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. Let's dive into, just quickly before we get to results, a brief overview of, as a reminder, in this study, we are looking at 2020 bid data for demand response resources, measuring the ELCC in 2020, both on a first-in and a last-in basis. In addition to looking at historical 2020 bid data to measure the ELCC in 2020, for informational purposes, we're also projecting forward and saying, in 2030, as the system, as the resource portfolio evolves, how might the ELCC of demand response change as well? As we talked about with the portfolio of resources, there's interactions between all of these resources, right? In fact, a lot of the value of these resources comes from interactions. Solar gets value because storage is on the system and can shift it around. Storage gets value because there's solar on the system to provide energy to charge so that it can actually provide capacity. So a lot of the value of all of these resources is derived from their interactions with each other. And so as the portfolio of resources change, we would expect the capacity value for any individual resource to change as well. And if we look at how the system is evolving between 2020 and 2030, we can see the primary differences are a reduction in thermal resources, a big increase in solar resources, both utility scale and customer solar, as well as some increase in wind and energy storage. And then a relatively small difference in demand response, but a slight increase. And so we are, in addition to, again, showing the ELCC of demand response in 2020, we're also showing the ELCC of demand response in 2030. And this is for informational purposes, and it's the ELCC of demand response in 2030 using the 2020 bid data. If we look at the primary factors that are driving the ELCC of really any resource, but in this case, demand response, ultimately what drives the ELCC, right, is the ability of a resource to improve the reliability of the system when you add that resource to the system. And the primary driver of a resource's ability to improve reliability is, can that resource produce during the time that the system most needs energy or capacity? Can the resource produce during the hours of the year where the loss of load probability is highest? If we look at this chart here on the left, this is showing, it's a heat map of all months of the year. That's the column, and all hours of the day, 24 hours, that's the row along top. Historically, the times of year that the system was most stressed or had the highest loss of load probability hours was when loads were highest, which occurs in the middle of the afternoon in the summer. So that's kind of where that sun is right there. 2, 3, 4 p.m. in June, July, August. That's historically the time that the system has been most stressed. In today's system, or last year's system in 2020, because there's so much solar on the system, even though loads are high, there's also an abundance of energy during that time period. And so the system is actually relatively not very stressed. The times of year and day that the system is most stressed today is later in the evening, later in the summer. So, for example, September from about 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. is really the time of year when the system most needs production from resources. That's the time of year when the system is most likely to experience loss of load. So any resource that can generate during those time periods is going to have a contribution to system reliability. And you can see here we've highlighted September from 5 to 9 p.m., but there are loss of load probability hours outside of that. There is loss of load probability hours in August. There's loss of load probability before 5 p.m. After 9 p.m., it's just not as strong. Most of the concentration is September from 5 to 9 p.m. If we look forward at the system in 2030, we can see how those loss of load probability hours change, which is driven by the change in the underlying portfolio of resources that are on the system. Primarily what's happening in 2030 is that the system is adding a lot of storage. If you'll recall on the previous slide, this system is going from less than a couple thousand megawatts of storage to almost 15,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030. And what that's doing is all of that energy storage is reducing the peak, but not only reducing the peak, but flattening and elongating the peak. So now the new net peak period in 2030, instead of going from 5 to 9, goes more from 5 p.m. to about midnight. And so for a resource to contribute reliability to the system, it now can't just generate from 5 to 9 p.m., it needs to generate from 5 p.m. to midnight. And if a resource is limited in its ability to generate during that entire time period, 4-hour storage, 4-hour battery is a great example of that, but also a demand response resource that has been calibrated to only dispatch from 5 to 9 p.m., if it's missing some of those key hours later in the evening or night, then it would have a reduction in its ELCC, or its contribution to reliability. Now, it doesn't mean that the resource has no value. It just means that its value is lower than what it would have been in 2020. Okay. So if we keep plowing through here, a couple more slides before we get into the exact results. But one of the important results that we're going to be showing here is not only the ELCC of demand response resources, but a comparison of those ELCCs to how those resources are being credited in the resource adequacy program by the CPUC using the load impact protocol methodology, or the LIP methodology, which again is different from the ELCC methodology. A brief background on how the load impact protocol filings work and how those ultimately flow into the credit that these demand response resources provide. If we take, for example, the year 2020, the utilities for the year 2020, the utilities actually file load impact filings in 2019 for what they expect the demand response resources to be in 2020. Those filings in 2019 happen in April, and those values, those load impact filings, ultimately feed into the net qualifying capacity, net qualifying capacity, or NQC, that demand response resources receive in 2020 in the resource adequacy program. Because those filings happen in April of 2019 data doesn't yet exist for the full year, and so those filings are actually based on 2018 data. I would say they're informed by 2018 data, but ultimately the filings in 2019 for the year 2020 are based on a forecast or an estimate of what is demand response enrollment going to be in 2020. So the whole point of this slide is to just illustrate the process that happens for utilities or demand response providers making forecasts of how demand response is going to show up in the market and getting credit in the resource adequacy program for those resources. So right off the bat, we can see that there's an assumption here about what enrollment is going to be in 2020 that has to be made in 2019, and to the extent that that forecast is not entirely accurate, then there is going to be some discrepancy in how the resources are credited versus how the resources actually show up in the market. If we just dig into this issue a little bit further, this is centrally showing the same thing, but from a slightly different perspective. Again, if we're talking about for the year 2020, all the way back starting in April of 2019, that's when the utilities would file on a year-ahead basis their estimates of demand response enrollment, and that's ultimately the filing that feeds into the resource adequacy credit that those demand response resources receive in the market. And again, because this is April 2019 data does not yet exist in entirety. These filings are informed from 2018 data, program year 2018 data, load impact per participant. If we jump forward a year from April 19 to April 2020, so we're headed into the summer of 2020, there's now more accurate updated enrollment estimates. The utilities filed these updated enrollment estimates with the CPUC, and then going into the actual month of operation, they have not an estimate, but the actual quantity of enrolled demand response participants, and they file those values with the CPUC as well. The problem is, well, I don't know if it's a problem or not, but a potential issue with this is that while these values are filed with the CPUC, the actual values that are used for planning purposes, which is the actual credit that these resources receive in the resource adequacy program, are the values that were filed in April of 2019, this first column here in this table, or this slide. And so because this first April 2019 year-ahead filing is the actual credit that these demand response resources receive in the RA program, that is the principle that we decided was most important for comparing the ELCC to the net qualifying capacity, or NQC, of these resources. And so in this, starting on the next slide, we'll be showing results. We're going to be showing the ELCC of demand response resources and comparing that to the NQC credit that these resources were accredited in the RA program. The NQC that we're comparing to is this year-ahead number. And so we just want to be clear with that. We would raise the issue that while undoubtedly there are some enrollment forecasting discrepancies with the final actual enrollments of these programs, that this is the reason we're using this is because this is what the credit these resources actually received. And, it's another issue or another step to sort of align, how these different values feed into the RA process, but that's somewhat a separate issue. Okay, so let's get into the results finally. So this slide right here is the big picture overall key finding of the entire report. And there's 3 different charts here that are very similar, so let's just kind of walk through them one by one. This first chart here on the left, this is actually just a snapshot of the prior study that we conducted. This is what we released last December. Again, this was using 2019 data. We released it in 2020. It was using 2019 data, and it was only looking at PG&E and SCE. The two charts here on the right are updated results from this study. The one in the middle is the exact same as the chart on the left, but with the updated 2020 data. So we're only looking at the same programs and the same utilities as we looked at last time. So the middle chart and the chart on the left should be relatively apples to apples, directly comparable with one another. And you can see, they look very similar. And then the chart on the right is the final results from this project, which is used 2020 demand response data. It has all of the utilities, both PG&E and SCE, but also SDG&E, and it also has some additional programs from SCE that we didn't include last time in the study. So to dig into the specifics of what these charts are, you can see there are 4 columns. We're measuring the ELCC of demand response in 2020 and 2030, as we discussed, on both a first-in basis and a last-in basis, also as we discussed. And you can see, in general, the first-in ELCCs are higher than the last-in ELCCs. The reason for that is because the first-in ELCC is really just the ability of demand response to clip the peak. The last-in is generally lower because now demand response is having to compete with energy storage, which is providing a very similar capability. And so there's only so many resources can clip the peak before the peak goes down and is elongated. And the capability of any energy limited resource to provide that elongated peak capacity over that elongated time period is going to be diminished. And so that's why the ELCC is slightly lower on the last-in basis than on the first-in basis. So the blue bars are the ELCC results. That's the output of the recap model. And then these horizontal black, yellow, and orange bars are the net qualifying capacity, or NQC values, that these demand response resources are receiving in the resource adequacy program. And we have adjusted these bars downward to remove the impact of the planning reserve margin credit and the transmission and distribution loss credit that these programs actually receive. So the actual value that these demand response programs are receiving in RA is about 25% higher than what we're showing here. But we've removed the planning reserve margin and the T&D, transmission distribution factors, from these NQC values so that they are directly apples to apples comparable with the ELCC values. And if we just focus here on the chart on the right, what you can see is that the ELCC values, the blue bars, are approximately about 20% lower than the NQC values that these programs are receiving in the RA program. There's also another piece of information in these charts, which are these dots, the black, orange, and yellow dots. And what those dots are showing is the aggregate maximum bid that demand response as a whole bid into the market in each month. The black is August, the yellow is July, the orange is September. And you can see right off the bat, if we just look at September, for example, if we look at this chart on the right, that demand response in aggregate never bid in any single hour as much as it was being credited in NQC in 2020. And this is not driven by anything to do with planning reserve margin or T&D. This is just what demand response is being credited for versus how it was bidding. And so, we would expect, right, if demand response was bidding at this level that the dot is at in every single hour, that is what the ELCC would be. This is just the maximum demand response was ever bidding. In many other hours, demand response was bidding lower than this level. And so that's what the ELCC is capturing, is the fact that it wasn't bidding at this level in every hour. In many hours, it was bidding lower than that. And so that's why there's an additional D-rate from the ELCC below those max bids. So you can you're trying to look at this and say, why is the ELCC lower than the NQC bars? The first reason is that demand response was just not bidding at the level it was being credited at. That's probably responsible for about half of the D rate. And then the other half of the D rate is due to the fact that it wasn't bidding at that max level in all hours. In many hours, it was bidding less than that. And so that's responsible for another part of the D rate. And when I say D rate, really, I just mean comparison of why is ELCC lower than NQC. So this chart here on the right of the slide you're looking at, this is really the big picture, everything aggregated together takeaway of how NQCs are, how those compare to the ELCC. We have a quick clarifying question that says, are the dots here showing averages for the whole month or only for the more extreme days? The dots are showing the single highest bid across the entire month for both standard average days and extreme days. So if bids are higher on extreme days, then we would pick that up, capture that, and that would be reflected in the dots.
Thanks, Zach. I think a good time now. I do believe we do have a couple in the queue as well. As a reminder, folks, clear questions only if you can. So thank you in advance.
We have a couple, excuse me, pardon me. We have a couple of hands raised in the question queue at this time. Would we like to go ahead and answer the call?
Yes, please.
All right, caller, you've been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Alan Meck from FDG&E. We go back to slide 23. So I thought that what you were saying with this slide was that demand response right now, it might be valued higher because it's usually able to better target, like when people are using their air conditioners, for example, from like 5 to 9 p.m., whereas in 2030, with the integration of more batteries pushing the peak out later and later, demand response might be valued a little bit lower. Was that your point with this slide, or am I misunderstanding that?
Nope, I think that's accurate.
Okay, so then I'm having trouble understanding your results because it looks like when you compare 2020 to 2030 on slide 26, except for one instance, it looks like usually 2030 is valued higher.
Right. So this is reflecting the value of demand response on a last-in basis, which is after all of the other resources around the system. So the difference between these two charts right here is that the one on the right has a whole lot of storage. This is, so if really the only way you can compare is looking at the last-in ELCCs in 2020 and 2030. And you can see that the last-in ELCCs are higher in 2020 or 2019 relative to 2030. On a first-in basis, they're actually, these two charts right here aren't relevant for the first-in basis because the first-in is really just looking at how can demand response contribute potentially to sort of the gross peak hours of the system where that sun is. And so, yeah, these heat maps are really just helping to explain the last-in differences, not the first-in differences.
I see. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So my next question then is, it seems like maybe the last-in methodology is a little bit funky, is the best way I could describe it. I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain what I'm thinking of. But if we go back to slide 17, maybe that graphic will help. Could you go back to 17?
I will go back to 17. I will caveat that if this is more than a clarifying question, if it's more a discussion topic, then we'll probably defer it till the end, but go ahead.
That's fine. I'd like to just raise the point now, and maybe I'm off on this, so you might be able to correct me. But so the way I'm thinking about this is if we're devaluing with the last-in methodology, if we're devaluing DR because of the integration of batteries, that seems backwards to me because in an optimized dispatch, batteries can be dispatched flexibly around other resources like DR. And so I would think that DR, instead of the last-in methodology is saying, well, DR can provide this amount at peak, but in 2030, DR starts to get shoved later and later where maybe it can't provide quite as much value as that peak shaving that it can do right here. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, well, in an optimized system, let's say that you've got a battery that has 6 megawatts of capacity that can be dispatched across 4 hours. Well, in an optimized system, maybe you would dispatch the DR at full capacity, and then instead of dispatching the battery for 4 hours at 6 megawatts, maybe you would dispatch that battery for 6 hours at 4 megawatts and use that battery to support more of that curve under DR.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Okay. So I appreciate the question. Hopefully a quick clarification can clear this up. When we say last in, we're not saying that demand response is dispatched last. We're saying all of the resources that you see in this chart right here are dispatched optimally. Storage is dispatched optimally. Demand response is dispatched optimally. The issue here is, how does demand response dispatch optimally in a system with all of the other resources? That's very different from how does demand response dispatch optimally in a system without any of the other resources, which is the first in. And so that's really what demand response is that's what first in versus last in is getting at. It's not getting at an order of how they're dispatched or saying that it's not dispatched optimally.
So then my response would be, if the only difference between your first in and your last in is the integration of batteries, then there shouldn't be a difference.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is a little bit beyond the clarifying question, so we'll probably defer, but there's a lot of background on this sort of issue of first in versus last in ELCC, and we can definitely provide materials on that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we do have...
Thanks. We've got a couple more in the chat if you want to get to those now. I don't know, operator, if you have any more in the queue.
We do have one more question in the verbal queue. We can either view the chat first or the verbal first, whichever you prefer.
Verbal first, if you don't mind. I think they were first. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Caller, you've been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLICA. Could you go back to, I think, the chart with the last-in dispatch? The follow-up to Alan Mack's question of what he was saying, I guess follow-up question to what he was saying is that little DR wedge, couldn't that then be optimal? Why isn't that optimally dispatched at the peak load in this graph? Why is it there and not at the peak? The same amount of energy, you're just moving it to which I would assume would be a higher value.
This is not, first of all, this chart is illustrative. And really the way in which storage and demand response would be dispatched, would have a lot to do with what is the total capacity of the resources and what is the duration of the resources. So what is their aggregate ability to provide capacity and how long can they provide that capacity for? That's what would drive how these resources dispatched around each other. This slide here is more illustrative, and I wouldn't necessarily read into this being an output of any of our results. Our results that we're showing are really based on DR bids. So we're looking at actually how demand response resources bid into the market.
Okay. So my next question, which is, you said bids, that's my next question is, how are the bids determined for each day and the hours? Are they capped by either the load impact protocols? Are they capped by a Pmax in the master file? If it's based on a Pmax in the master file, how is that Pmax determined?
So the bids are bids that the individual utilities, IOUs, submit. They determine how to bid in their resources, and I would go so far as to say that that's just something that's provided to us. We don't in any way determine how these resources are bidded in. And I would also potentially even go so far as to say that the strategies that the IOUs use to bid is relatively proprietary. So, yeah, we don't really have a ton of visibility into how those bids are determined. We just have what the bids are, which is ultimately all the CAISO can dispatch. The CAISO gets the bids. They can dispatch the resources or not. They can't dispatch more than the bids are. And so that's why it provides sort of an upper bound of what the capability of these resources are if they were to dispatch it.
But the response, they bid amount, the response could actually be above the bid amount. It could be above or below, right?
We are not assuming, we are assuming that the bids are the capability of the resource. So, because that is what the CAISO can dispatch. If the response, if the bids are under the capability then of the resource, then the bids should be higher. But we're not assuming that the response is higher than the bids.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul, this is John Gooden. The bids are essentially the forecast of what the utility thinks that resource can deliver in that particular hour. And so it's,
right.
It's supposed to be able to produce that value. And we know it's not a perfect world because it is somewhat of a forecast, but they do a pretty good job, really.
But the bid wouldn't exceed the Pmax in the master file. So is there any guidance
Correct.
on the CAISO tariff of how to determine the Pmax for DR? Is it based on a load of, a 1 in 10 lip? Is it based on something else?
It's what the utility puts in there. So that's
the utility has control over okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
All right, this is Ethan once again. Just to make you aware, we do have another question that just popped up in the verbal queue, but we can go ahead with some of the chat questions since they came in previously.
Okay, there are a lot of chat questions here, so I'm just going to try to see. Are the NQC levels for demand response showing the supply showing levels of NQC, or are they the total NQC? I am not entirely sure I understand that question. The NQCs that are shown on this chart are the NQCs that were filed in the April 2019 filing. that were based on or informed by program year 2018 load impact per participant. So that's what the NQCs on this slide are showing.
And these NQCs are minus the adders, if that's what the question is ultimately getting at.
Yeah, I see. Okay, yep, that's those. You're right. These NQCs have subtracted the adders. Yes.
You look at the text at the top. If that's your question, that should answer it.
There was a question if we are looking at what DR was received versus what was bid. We are not looking at what DR was received. There's the primary reason for that is because most of the time demand response is not dispatched. So if we were only looking at what demand response was received, many hours we would see no demand response was received, but that's only because it wasn't dispatched, because it wasn't needed. Therefore, we think that the bid values of demand response is a more accurate representation of its capability than the demand response that was received. There is a question, how does ELCC compare to what the LIP values would have been using the actual rather than the forecasted enrollment numbers? If I think the question here is to what extent is, the underlying question here, right, is to what extent is the discrepancy between these NQC values, these bars, these horizontal bars, and the blue ELCC bars, to what extent is that discrepancy driven by a misforecasting of enrollment? If you look at this slide right here, while this is just looking at one program, right, for SCE, this is their base interruptible program, you can see enrollment has gone down slightly from the year ahead into the month of operation, that sort of small black dash in each of those three. We haven't done numbers for all the programs, but we don't think that the majority of the discrepancy between the NQCs and the ELCCs is driven by forecasting, enrollment forecasting issues. We think that's probably a small difference, and it really could go either way in different programs. We think that the vast majority of the discrepancy is driven by just the protocols and the way these resources bid into the market and the way that they're counted for NQC purposes.
And Zach, just to layer onto that, it's in that graphic to the far left, that previous slide, that number that's used for the RA crediting, that's the number that is used for compliance and crediting and for plan. And so it's an interesting question to ask, well, what if we'd updated this or that through the year? The bottom line is that is the bogey. That's what we all planned around. And unless and until a utility got into a particular month and enrollments, let's say, went down, and therefore what was predicted and actually credited, if it was actually less, did that utility go out and buy additional capacity to make that up, that RA credit? I can 99% guarantee you, no, they didn't. It was just sort of a fact of life. That RA credit was the RA credit. So that's why that's such an important metric to base our comparison against. And the principle is what was credited, what did we all plan around? That's the number that matters.
Okay, let's do one more clarifying question. Did Chris Devon, I think he's in the verbal queue now. If he wants to unmute, I saw there were some questions that he wrote in the chat, but it might be easier just to verbalize it.
I'll go ahead and unmute what appears to be his line. Caller, you've been unmuted. Is this Chris?
Yes, it is. Thank you. It's Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Zach and John, for the presentation. just to clarify my question, just to try to understand on slide 26 about those horizontal bars that you have there. The intent I was trying to get across in my written question, which wasn't very clear, was are you guys using the actual RA supply plan showings for those values, or is that the total NQC that's like in the NQC list itself? And if there is a difference there, is there any reason for doing it differently? If that makes sense.
That goes to the last point I just made. Remember, these aren't shown. These are only credited, and that's that year ahead value. That's the RA credit provided. So IOU programs aren't shown.
Yes.
That's part of this whole bigger debate.
So basically, John, what you're saying is once these are established at that year ahead time frame, then that's the number, and it gets flows through the entire year.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay. So once you figure out the one for August in the annual showing, that's not going to change. There's going to be no update. I think I fully follow now. So that does make a lot more sense to me, and thanks for the clarification there.
Yeah, and the utilities do make some updates and adjustments, and that's why the bids vary appropriately, because they're trying to give you the best estimate. But as far as, again, we have to sort of point back to RA as a planning function. What did we plan around? What was credited? And what remains the credit, which is the bogey we're comparing to throughout the year. And it's that year ahead showing. And in fact, if you look at the PUC's decision of 2 days ago, they reiterate the point that they are going to use the load impact annual and continue to RA to provide credits for RA for year 2022, and they'll consider these ELCC results in the monthly. But again, that just reemphasizes the point that it's that annual RA credit amount that is used throughout the year.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you for that, John. I guess I have one more clarifying question, just as far as kind of the overall process goes. Are you, or is the CAISO thinking of possibly advocating for this approach to be applied for anything else other than the kind of IOU DR programs that are on the credit side of it, and it, like if it could be used for just other third-party PDR type resources as well at the PUC during that process?
Yeah, I think from the ISO perspective, we think that this methodology makes sense for any DR resource, be it IOU or third party, that has a variable nature, going forward. For 2022, I don't see this impacting third parties because they're locked into certain contracts and certain expectations. They're already subject to RAIM. They're already put on supply plans. They're not credited. So for 2022, our real focus is getting those IOU programs on the supply plan like all other IOU resources and providing a vehicle to properly assess these resources so that we can exempt them from RAIM and they can be put on the supply plan.
Okay, got it. I just wanted to try to make that linkage to the other RAIM exemption options discussion that was recently had as well, and just to see if there might be that potential for the PDR to potentially, do that down the road, perhaps through the CPUC program. So thank you for that. That's fine. I appreciate all the clarification.
You bet. You bet, Chris.
Okay, it looks like we actually, I believe, do have two more in the verbal queue. I think it probably makes sense to just address those now before we keep going.
Alrighty, I'll go ahead. Paul, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. This is Luke Chugas, consultant for California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. Thanks for this workshop today. This is an interesting presentation. Zach, I apologize for going back to the issue you were talking about with Paul Nelson, but could you please go to slide 18? I think it was slide 18. Yeah, there we go. So you had mentioned something earlier, and just kind of picking up where you guys left off. You said that you're not making in doing this analysis, you're not making a determination on what the bidding strategy is, for the DR resources. But however, you did mention earlier on that you are assuming optimal dispatch, and can you square those two statements? I'm not quite sure what that means. Optimal dispatch.
Yeah, actually, so I should clarify. The way that for these results that we're looking at, that we were just looking at, those ELCCs, those are based on utility demand response bids. We are not modifying those in any way to be more optimal, less optimal, whatever. We're just using those bids. We are modifying the system around those bids. So we are dispatching storage around that demand response optimally that maximizes the value of the entire portfolio of resources for capacity. Now, there are other ways. I guess when I referred to demand response being optimally dispatched, we often calculate the ELCC of demand response more theoretically, where we plug in the capabilities of demand response, saying, this is the capacity, this is how many times you can use it per year, this is how many hours of response you get when you call it. In that case, our model does optimally dispatch it, but I should clarify that's not what's happening in this portion of the analysis. We are just using the bids unaltered.
So the bids and this slide 18, this curve, is this meant to reflect 2030 or 2020, or is it more generic, just to apply to both?
This is very generic. Yeah, very generic.
Okay, thank you.
This is more on the system and more storage, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And just one minor point I want to touch on the issue that we're also just talking about now, and that is, I know you were talking about, you're highlighting correctly the fact that, in the monthly ILP reports, that reflects the actual enrollments versus forecasted enrollments in the utility DR programs, and that certainly is a factor, that creates uncertainty between the load impact analyses and then, the actual amount of capacity that's delivered by each DR program. But there's a second factor as well, and this is why the ILP reports, this is why you cannot really use their ex-ante analyses or ex-ante numbers from those, and that is the per customer ex-ante load impact. When you're looking at those reports, the ex-ante numbers that you see in those reports, those reflect the actual enrollment and the forecasted, or I should say more accurately, the per customer ex-ante load impact from the most recent load impact evaluation report. So that also is not reflected, or the updated per customer number is not reflected there either. Just as a clarification for you.
Say, Zach, this is John. Could you just take a minute? I think slide 18, if I'm not mistaken, actually gets to saturation issues as well. It's like, if you have this abundance of storage on the system in 2030, and you have DR as well, and if they historically are chasing the same set of hours, the value goes down, the ELCC value. Their contribution to reliability decreases over time to where any incremental storage or DR in those same set of hours has little to no additional incremental value to the system, just like continue to add solar. Unless you put storage with it and hybridize it, has little value. And so it seems that, this speaks to some of those issues as well. It's like, where does it squeeze the value of resources if everything's chasing the same, historically chasing the same set of hours? Maybe you can mention something about that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that point about saturation, is something that we investigated in our initial study. And we don't have those slides today, but if you read it, they're actually in the presentation that's been posted. But they kind of highlight the saturation effects and how each incremental tranche of really any resource, but in this study, demand response, how each incremental tranche is less valuable than the previous tranche because of the diminishing return and the saturation. So there's effects that go both ways. There's positive interactive effects. Energy limited resources interact with resources like solar, but there's positive effects there, but there's also negative effects of saturation, whereas you add more of any individual resource, the incremental value goes down. So that's also part of what's ultimately reflected in the 2030 numbers. If we look at this chart and why 2030, at least on a last-in basis, tends to be lower than in 2030 than in 2020.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to wait till the Q&A section at the end, but since it's come up, I will address that now. It's been commission policy for close to 2 decades, a decade and a half, that energy efficiency and demand response resources are preferred resources. And Zach, you don't necessarily need to respond to this. I just want to put this out there and as such, for DR to be treated as, the last one to show up at the party throughout these analyses is completely contrary to how the Commission has always seen demand response. And so any consideration about whether or not the ELCC value of DR should be, based on last in or first in, clearly seems to me that it should be based on first in, because otherwise, anything other than that would undermine it as a preferred resource.
Yeah, and Luke, I can't resist. Sorry, I get that preferred resource, and it's been treated a certain way for the last however many decades. But the past is not the present or future. The grid is changing, and so much DR. I think the Commission clearly recognizes this, and so just because that's how it was doesn't mean that's how it will be going forward. DR can still be a preferred resource, but that doesn't mean it has to be stuck in the mud.
Well, I think that's up to the PUC to decide, John, first of all. And second of all, DR is capped already. So, to your point, unfortunately, the tragic thing about all this is that DR, though it is a preferred resource according to Commission decision, it has not been treated as such. And it's always been given short shrift in every planning process, IRP and RA and everything else. And so, if it truly was treated as a preferred resource, then I think we would have a lot fewer problems with DR than we do today.
Well, we'll leave it at that, Luke. But again, I think that's where we have these load modifying rulemaking coming up, because the Commission does clearly see that things are changing and we need a different path.
Yeah, I think good discussion, good questions. The only thing I'd add is that, we can debate about whether first in or last in is more appropriate. I would argue that the first in or last in name probably implies a little bit more about the priority of the resources than it actually is. Last in doesn't mean it's the last resource at the party. It just means that it accounts for interactions with other resources. First in doesn't. So we probably, this is pretty established terminology, but I don't love the implications of the term. I don't think that the first in, last in demarcation really has anything to do with priority. I would also say that even if demand response is counted on a first in basis, it's still being significantly overcredited relative to its true value by about 20% instead of maybe 25%. So. Maybe not for IOU DR programs, but we'll never know with third-party DR because nobody's taking a look at that. Yeah, you're right. This is just looking at IOU programs. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think let's see. let's go ahead and keep going here, and then we can come back to questions, clarifying questions or discussion questions. I guess so. Just on this slide 26 right here, again, this chart on the left is last year's update using 2019 data. The chart in the middle is this update just on an apples-to-apples comparison, looking at the same IOUs, the same programs. And you can see from 2019 to 2020, there's a couple small changes. The NQCs actually have gone down slightly. So the horizontal black, orange, and yellow bars have decreased slightly, while at the same time the ELCCs have actually increased slightly. So just looking at these programs, there actually has been some convergence of NQCs to ELCCs. Still, some amount of mismatch here, but some convergence relative to 2019. And if we kind of dig into what's driving these changes, why the NQCs have decreased slightly, why the ELCCs have increased slightly, we've shown here a breakdown for those two IOUs that are included in those charts, PG&E and SCE, looking at different DR programs that they offer, as well as different LCAs or local capacity areas for each of those programs. And you can see we have some heat maps here. This sort of second from the right column is looking at NQCs, and green means that NQCs have increased from 2020 relative to 2019. Red means that NQCs have decreased. And so when we see overall, if we go to the previous slide, the NQCs have decreased in 2020 relative to 2019. In the aggregate, that is largely driven by, summing all of these NQC changes, and there are more reds than greens in the NQC column. So overall, NQCs have gone down. And then if we say, okay, ELCCs have gone up slightly, what's driving that? Well, that's driven by ultimately the bids. And so if we just take one attribute of the bids, which is the max bid, the hour of the month where they bid the most, how those max bids change, you can see that there's been a mix and a match, some increases, some decreases, but overall slightly more increase than decrease, particularly for SCE. And so that's what's driving the ELCCs being slightly higher from 2020 data as compared to 2019 data. So there's just a little bit of a breakdown and an explanation for some of the changes in this latest update. If we continue to dig in a little bit, back up here, again, I'll point you to this chart on the right, and in particular, the first in ELCC for 2020, so the leftmost blue bar of the rightmost chart. This is an aggregate of all three IOUs, SCE, PG&E, and SDG&E. If we disaggregate those out by utility, that's what these three charts are showing right here. So this is the first in ELCC for 2020, disaggregated by utility. And you can see how the ELCC for PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E compares to the net qualifying capacity NQC credit, which again are those horizontal yellow, black, and orange bars that each of these IOUs are receiving for DR. And you can see the percentage comparisons of how the ELCC compares to those different monthly NQC values. And you can see for PG&E and SCE, it's roughly a 15 to 20% overvaluing. For SDG&E, somewhere closer to 50% overvaluing. And again, max bids by month are also provided here for informational purposes, again, just to show what some of the primary drivers of these ELCC values are. So for PG&E, ELCC is actually relatively close to the max bid. For SDG&E, it's much lower, which means for SDG&E's programs, there are a lot of hours that are being bid lower than the max bid that are ultimately informing and feeding into the ELCC values. So the values here, are one piece of information for the commission to consider in potentially making adjustments to NQC values. NQC values, if the commission wants to align NQC values more with the ELCC of demand response, could implement that in multiple ways, could implement a system-wide adjustment where everything is lumped together, or potentially implement an IOU by IOU adjustment that's based on, for example, this information right here. If we go into even further breakdown, these results are by IOU. And if we go into breakdown program by program, local capacity area by local capacity area, you can see ELCC values compared to August NQC values. And these are shown on a percentage basis. So the percentages here are simply how does the ELCC megawatts compare to the August NQC megawatts. And those are a ratio of one another, and those ratios are shown here as a percentage. So what that means, if you see a value that's greater than 100%, that means that these resources are actually showing up in the market more than they were being credited for in the RA process via NQC. If the values are less than 100%, these resources are showing up less than the NQC values that they're being credited for in the RA process. I think while what we're looking at here is for PG&E specifically, I think one of the things that we think is the case for these program-specific results is that there's a lot of noise. There's more potential for data issues. There's more potential for small changes in enrollment, particularly for smaller programs that just aren't as big, for enrollment misforecasts to have large impacts on these values. So while I think these are somewhat informative, we would potentially be a little bit hesitant to look too much into these program-specific values just because they are relatively noisy, at least from the perspective of potentially informing adjustments to NQC values to better align with ELCC. So this chart right here is showing PG&E. We also have these values for SCE, which you can see right here. Again, showing the same thing. It's ELCC megawatts as a percentage of the NQC, August NQC megawatts. Values less than 100% means these resources were showing up less than what they were being credited for in the RA program. Values greater than 100% mean the opposite. And again, for informational purposes, we have the max bid for each of these programs, for each of these local capacity areas as well. And then, I won't pause too long. These slides are public, so feel free to dig into the specifics and spend more time on each of these slides. And then finally, we have here for SDG&E for the programs that we looked at and included. So that wraps up all of the results that we were hoping to show. Again, this is just a more granular breakdown, so there's different levels of how you can slice and dice these results, but I'll just back up again to really the key takeaway slide that has everything lumped together, which is this chart here on the right. And I think we can go back to any questions now, clarifying or more discussion-based questions.
Thanks a lot, Zach. I don't know, operator, if you have any folks in the queue, I do see a couple of written chats.
We do have a question in the queue at this time. Would you like me to put them through?
Please.
Caller, you have been on. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLICA. So earlier you mentioned that these results are based on the bids and not program design, calls per hour, calls per month or year and hours per call, but based on their bids and how it results in the loss of load expectation or probability results. So if a program wants to maximize their ELCC value, what information is provided for them to do their program design? And to the extent the program design and the bids are flexible and they could change the bidding behavior to maximize this, how do they get that information? And then is there any guarantee in the next iteration that how they change their bidding behavior, they would get a higher ELCC?
Yeah. So, I would say from a very high level perspective, the best way to increase your ELCC or anyone's ELCC is to bid higher. You can see right here that, let's just look at this chart on the right. Again, the leftmost bar of the right-hand chart. We just look at the orange dot versus the orange bar. The aggregate maximum bid of the highest bid hour for all of September is over 100 megawatts lower than the amount these resources were being credited. So at no point did these resources ever bid within 100 megawatts of what they were being credited for. And in fact, they were being credited several hundred megawatts higher than that once you account for the planning reserve margin and T&D issue. So, that really is the easiest, simplest, clearest way to increase ELCC. That doesn't have anything to do with what hours are you bidding in, what are your call constraints, all of that. It just has to do with bidding higher or bidding up to the level that these resources are being credited with. Then you can start to say, okay, well, if I want to actually get that value as my ELCC, I need to make sure that I'm bidding that value in all of the most important hours. And the easiest place to start there is to look at the heat map of what the most important hours are, which are very well aligned actually with the RA hours, that demand response. It's really 5 to 9 p.m., actually primarily in September, but to a certain extent August as well. So making sure that you bid high, not just in 1 hour, but consistently across those important hours from 5 to 9 p.m. in September. And that's the secret sauce. I mean, there's really not much to it than that. You go for it on 20. Yeah.
We've already done that. We have the availability assessment hours to encourage program design and bidding, yet it's not resulting in high ELCC values.
Well, I would say it's not resulting in high bids. It's not resulting in bids during those hours that are commensurate with what those resources are being credited with. The ELCC simply reflects the bids, and the bids are lower.
Okay, so my next question is, going back to this issue of customer enrollment changes from when the NQC is established and the bids are done or submitted. Some of that reduction is not necessarily due to a customer leaving the program, but the load remains. It could be the customer and the load and the DR has left the system. And you also, in 2020, you've got the issue of COVID. Have you incorporated any sort of adjustments for that in this analysis?
Paul, these are the bids. So the bids are the bids and reflect what the IOUs thought was what they could realistically deliver. So it should reflect all of those.
But what about the NQC?
The NQC is what was credited. If the utilities, again, in every month, let's say that enrollment went down or capability went down.
So 100 megawatts of load, 100 megawatts of load, and that's just to make it easy. Go with 100 megawatts of DR left the system, and so now we've got the forecasted load. It's dropped, and and you're saying that the crediting that's a problem.
If we credited that the utilities and the RA, I don't think the RA amounts went down in 2020. In fact, we had some extreme conditions. Let's say load went away and was no longer available as demand response, but the RA amount requirement didn't change. Did the utilities go out and voluntarily buy another 100 megawatts of RA?
So we have load dropping. You have load dropping, but yet you would still want to go out and procure resources for the load that's disappeared.
Yeah, because the load, what happens to load versus what happens to resources, the supply, those are two different things. And we can't conflate that one customer that went away that was providing DR, that somehow because that load went away, now your supply went away. If that didn't get reflected in the RA requirement and the RA requirement didn't change and we still needed that 100 megawatts, we still need 100 megawatts of that supply because the RA requirement changed or didn't change. Now, if the RA requirement went down 100 megawatts, then maybe. But that's not how it works.
So we have a problem on both sides. On both, the RA requirement doesn't reflect, so the RA requirement doesn't reflect changes in forecast versus the latest, information, and then neither does the NQC.
Well, there are some updates to the RA requirement, and the PUC can speak more to that, the mid-year, load migration, things like that. But I think what you're talking about, it's sort of creating dust where none exists. I don't see this as...
I disagree. You seem to be looking at the dust in only in one direction. I definitely agree that there's definitely a problem between when the LIP gets established and in real time when these RA supply plans and checks be done. There's definitely a lag that needs to get corrected. You're utilizing better information, but that also goes to the load forecast as well. Also needs to align as well.
Yeah, I think what I would say is, the discrepancy that we're seeing between the ELCC and the NQC credit is a persistent problem, at least across 2 years. But I would guess if we were to go back in time, we would also see this. It appears to be a structural problem in the way these resources are credited versus how they bid into the market. And I agree with John that, discrepancies about load are, while potentially might be an issue that need to be looked at, are really separate and should be not conflated with this right here, which is just looking at the specifics of demand response. And I don't think there's any reason to think that the load issue structurally impacts this demand response valuation in any direction.
And then the last thing is you were talking about the distribution of the loss of load probability heat maps. Has that been made available for people to look at? Or is that's the only chart? But you said there were other months. Is it only September from 5 to 9 or 5 to midnight for 2030?
Yeah, these values have been made available. These charts have been made available in every study and update that we've done going back a year. So this chart on the right is slightly different with some updates of the latest study, but broadly it aligns very well with the previous studies and refresh updates that we've released. I would also say that very similar outputs are embedded in various CPUC proceedings for cost effectiveness of demand response and really cost effectiveness of all demand side resources. So these results in various iterations and updates are publicly made available for many years.
So what I'm saying is the results of your refresh, your distribution of loss of load probability, that's going to inform the ELCC. Is that? I don't think that's been published. I mean, you said earlier there was other months or perhaps times where there was loss of load expectation other than September. But if someone's trying to look at their program and their bid behavior and assess whether the results seem to make sense or not, there's no way to determine that because we don't know, we can't see the distribution of loss of load expectation to know, well, what hours are the programs not bidding or bidding lower values where it wouldn't be avoiding the loss of expectation to validate this result. But that can't be ascertained because there's a lack of information here.
Okay. So these heat maps right here with these colors are based on numbers. So we will get those numbers published. The reason we didn't include those in this is because we were more trying to just visually show without, crowding up the slide sort of what hours, what months are most important, but we can absolutely release those numbers. And you will see that they're proportional to the darkness of the red here, but we'll get those released.
Yeah, I don't think that's a big lift, right?
No.
Zach, I mean,
no, we
can
already
publish
have
those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
These heat maps, like you said, that I believe IRP has produced these. These are very common ways to graphically convey loss of load expectations and probabilities. So it is far from unique in this use and instance.
Mm-hmm.
No, I know what the heat maps are. I'm just saying we haven't seen the results of your loss of load distribution. I mean, there's programs that they're high load factor customers that are available 24/7, 6 hours per call, 10 calls per month. Yet the results are still showing 80% reductions, and I can't figure out why.
Well, I think the thing is, though, Paul, is that E3 used all of the bids, and if BIP is 24/7. And it was bidding every day, every hour, that's embedded here in these results, period.
Unless there's an error buried in their model that they don't realize it's there. And anybody who's done analysis, in these complex models, sometimes you result, whoops. When I look at something that doesn't make sense and you dig deep to find out why, you discover, whoops. There was this mistake made or something wasn't being done properly. And I'm not trying to attack E3. It's just that I've said I'm trying to understand the results, and it's very difficult to understand it because of the lack of information.
I mean, I think, you could pursue seeing the bid data for your bid customers to see what their distribution looks like across the hours as well. That would be between you and the utilities, but how they're actually bidding your customers' load is providing these kind of results. So I don't know if you know how that's being done. Do you have that? Do you see the bid for your Paul?
Well, I'm sorry, there was background noise.
Yeah. Do you have access and see the bids for your customers so you can see how they're being bid?
No,
okay.
That's utility data.
Okay, so that may be a place you want to pursue.
Thanks, Paul. I hate to cut it off, but I think the point is well taken, Paul. I really appreciate your comments. I do encourage you to put in written comments as well, Paul. But we do have a number of other questions, about 10 minutes left. Let's be sure that other folks are able to get their questions in.
Okay. All right.
Operator, do we have any more verbal questions left in the queue? We do see a number of chat.
We do have one more in the queue. I can go ahead and put them through now if you'd like.
Yes, please, and we can get to the chat questions to conclude the call. I think that should work well.
Alrighty, caller, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Alan Wong from Southern California Edison. I think I maybe want to add one comment that hopefully with the help what Paul is raising, I think one thing that's missing from the heat maps that maybe isn't explicit as it should be is sort of this weekday, weekend bidding pattern. So, when you tie that back to what the load impact findings are, it's sort of weekend events kind of correspond to lower customer reference load, which can result in lower load impacts, right? So I think the NQC currently, how it's structured today, from my understanding, it only takes the weekday event performance to inform the ex-ante forecast. Now, it sounds like what the ELCC, the recap ELCC modeling is doing is sort of not binding it by only weekday views, but more of like weekday weekends when the grid needs it runs into a condition that's a loss of load event. So I think maybe potentially keeping that in mind as well, that it's not just only 5 to 9, but it's sort of that daily difference between a weekday, weekend event that may be causing some of this discrepancy in comparison, and also can probably provide some insight on why we're seeing lower ELCC megawatts. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
Thanks a lot, Alan.
Yeah, it's a good point, Alan. I guess one other sort of comment I'd add on that is that if we all recall, last summer, the notorious event occurred on the weekend. So.
Thanks, Zach. I do see a couple of chat questions. I don't know, Zach, if you saw them, but Josh Bowden again is asking if there is a shift to ELCC with the D rates for duration, availability, et cetera, and the E3/CPC DR cost affecting this tool go away?
I would probably say I wouldn't speculate on policy here. I mean, yeah.
That's E3. That's not. Josh, it's an interesting question, but it's not one that I think ISO or E3 can even answer. That's really a PUC question.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, guys. And the other question from Leslie
here. Yeah, there's a question about discrepancies using 1 and 2 peak weather conditions versus the 1 and 10. So, the values in these charts are based on the historical weather data that actually occurred, at least in the 2 right-hand charts in 2020 and in the left-hand chart in 2019. So, I think these results are, I don't want to, limited is probably too strong of a word, but they're limited by the weather conditions that occurred in those years. I think one thing we have discussed as a next step would be to get almost simulated bids or synthetic bids across multiple weather year conditions, and we could take those bids, run the exact same analysis, produce an update. That would be, potentially an informative step. But, I would just also clarify that 2020 was a pretty stressful year. We obviously had a loss of load event. So if we're looking for sort of a year that is a stressful year, we found it. And then 2019 was a less stressful year, and we have those results too. So I don't know that there's going to be anything earth-shattering about that, but I think that is a recognized issue that I think at least we've discussed potentially investigating further. There's another question from Gil Wong about how these ELCC results should be applied to LIP for RA 2022. I think E3's, at least E3's perspective on that, again, is that we're just trying to provide information for the PUC and all parties to come up with policy proposals or adjustments. I don't know that we're necessarily making recommendations policy recommendations about how these results should be applied, other than putting forward information about how this information could be used to inform D rates, either at a system level, an individual utility level, individual program level, et cetera. Just providing information that shows the ELCC relative to how those programs are being credited.
Thanks a lot, Zach. I do see one final chat question from Stephanie Whalen asking how we would value DR in the face of climate change. And we do work with the CEC, Stephanie, for forecasting and planning. And I don't know if John or if someone wants to add anything on to that as a segue maybe for 2023 process moving forward.
I think you answered it properly. I mean, climate change impacts are obviously being deeply discussed and considered in the planning assumptions, both at the CEC on the forecasting and at the PUC and the procurement decisions, both in the IRP and planning for resource adequacy. So it's definitely considered, no doubt.
Great, and I'm not sure, maybe we have 2 minutes left, so maybe a couple seconds to get any last questions on the phone. I don't know, operator, if we have anything in the queue, but looks like that's it for the chat.
Hey, Jimmy.
I appreciate everyone waiting for questions until the end.
And Jimmy, I just want to say and just clarify for folks that there is the CEC process that's going to be launching here shortly. That's going to dive more deeply into these kind of details about the value for demand response. For the 2023 REA compliance year, again, what we're focused here is what can we do for 2022 and allow the ISO to provide a RAIM exemption and seek a RAIM exemption from FERC for these resources. But again, the longer term, 2023, is going to be through that CEC process.
Appreciate that, John. Operator, any final questions before we conclude for today?
At this time, there are no hands raised in the verbal queue.
Great. If you could sling the presenting rights back to me real quick, Ethan, I appreciate it, just to go over the next steps and final slide here. All right.
All right. You should have them now.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, folks, as far as next steps, as you can see, we are asking for comments. As mentioned, it's a tight window. We appreciate your flexibility. We're going to have a comments template posted up shortly, although it's going to be very generic, just asking for your feedback on the study results today and any additional comments you wish to provide. Please send those to the initiative comments at kaiso.com mailbox. There's the due date, June 28th. So we appreciate those in advance. As mentioned, this was recorded, and you can look for that to be posted within the next couple of business days. So thank you once more and for everyone's engagement, especially as we're still working remote. So have a great rest of your day, folks.